It's my immense pleasure to extend you the warmest of welcomes to this workshop on local languages as the language of instruction at the university. Workshops like this serve as invaluable platforms for the exchange of ideas, the forging of new connections, and the cultivation of knowledge. And that's exactly the main goal of this workshop, to learn about the experiences of others and improve our management of local languages and strike the right balance between them and English. Today we are at the University of the Basque Country, and therefore our concern is how the internalization and anglicization may affect the Basque language. A language is still immersed in the normalization and revitalization process despite the significant process and progress made in the recent decades. However, we see that we are not the only ones concerned. Throughout Europe, other linguistic communities have also expressed their concern. The last news I've received about this came from the Netherlands, from the country that we usually admire for things like this. The Netherlands, okay. Wait, okay, thank you. The Netherlands ranks first position of 100 countries in EF English Proficiency Index, or that's ranked best non-native English speaker for 4 years in a row. But at what price? And that's the news I got from a German newspaper, the Verenglisung der Niederlande. Or here we have the same news in the French newspaper. In universities, English has established itself both because many publications are in this language and because establishments want to attract as many foreign students as possible. Some voices, like the Communist Allied Regions in the newspaper The Volkskrant, protest against this situation. It is sad to see how teachers and students communicate in a language in which they are not at their best, write the journalist. Linguist and writer Wien Daniels said that this development was worrying, at least if we consider that Dutch must be preserved. The interim Minister of Education has prepared a bill which could be submitted to Parliament for a vote in the second half of 2025, and which provides that only a third of bachelor's courses can be taught in a foreign language. The deputies largely support it, but the universities concerned about their recruitment are worried. Therefore, as we see, this balance between local language and instruction language is crucial not only for minority languages like Basque, Catalan, or Welsh, but also for state languages such as Danish, Dutch, German, Swedish, and so on. Also, I would like to highlight the great importance of local languages and the language of instruction with the future development of artificial intelligence, since as voices, for instance, in the field of Spanish linguistics have been expressing lately, artificial intelligence needs a well-developed corpus to be an authentic artificial intelligence in its language and not a mere translation from English. And we watched that news on the Spanish television. And if Spanish linguists are worried about that, how should we be? So I thus encourage each of you to absorb the wealth, knowledge, and experiences that we are about to learn about today. May this workshop be fruitful and rewarding experience for all, the University of the Basque Country, but also other universities with similar concerns and situations. And now let us proceed to the first talk of our workshop. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Professor David Bloch. Professor David Bloch works currently at the University Pompeu Fabra after holding positions at the Universitat de Lleida and the University of London. He's a career research professor in social linguistics in the Department of the Humanitats at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, and a member of the Grup de Recerca en Espais Interculturals de Llengües i Identitats. Recently, he's been focused on two quite distinct aspects of our societies, the so-called post-truth and the internalization of higher education worldwide as part of the neoliberalization of contemporary societies. It is this last topic which motivated us to invite him to this workshop, and his talk will deal with it now. So, Professor Bloch, moltes gràcies per brindar-nos l'oportunitat d'escoltar-vos avui aquí, and the floor is yours.
Egunon, if I said that correctly. It's kind of interesting. I'm giving this talk in English, and I have very mixed feelings about doing that, as I often do when I give talks in different places in the world, and even in Barcelona sometimes giving talks. Sometimes I give them in Catalan, some in Spanish, but very often in English. And the whole issue of English medium instruction is something that I only came to be interested in the past 6 or 7 years. Can you hear me all right, everybody? Okay. And if I look back, I mean, going back, over 40 years ago, I was an English teacher in Barcelona, and when I started, when I moved more into the realm of academia, that's what I studied, was English language teaching. And when I did my PhD, that's what it was on, English language teaching. But by the time we get to the late 90s, at which time I was living in London, I became interested in globalization, multilingualism, multiculturalism, and identity. And I think because I realized I was about 40 years old and I didn't know who I was, because I'd lived in Barcelona for 18 years. I lived my first 22 years in the United States. And I also realized that research is very autobiographical. Very often, if not always, when we do research, it has something to do with our personal life trajectory or biography, right? And so grafting, taking what's around me, when I was in London, I became interested in these issues around globalization and identity. And then with the economic crisis, I became interested in political economy, and also particularly a Marxist perspective on political economy. And that led me to study neoliberalism as the current dominant form of global capitalism, and social class inequality. And then moving on more recently, looking at critical discourse studies and analyzing political discourse. Now, I mention all of this because when I turned to looking at English medium instruction, I was bringing all of this with me, right? And so today, what I'll do, I think I'll just, hold on. Well, I'll use this, yeah. What I'll be doing today is, the description of the talk is what you see here, but I'm going to set this as kind of a problematization. I'm going to problematize English medium instruction and talk about problems, issues that I see as worth examining. And so there are 5 of them listed here, and I'll try to get through all of them. Some of them I'll spend more time on than others, right? Now, the first thing is, the background. I became involved, as I said, about 6 or 7 years ago, and it was through a project, a Mineco project, and it was called ASCEMID, which was the acronym we used. It's produced quite a few publications. Among them is this book you see here, which I co-edited with Sarah Khan in 2021. And at the end of this talk, if we have time, I have a bibliography of stuff that I've published based on this issue. And a lot of what I'm saying today is taken from these different publications. Now, the problem with internationalization, if we're going to talk about internationalization, we have to look at what's behind it, I think. And so if we go back to the whole political economy of the world that we live in, we have neoliberalism, which is a term I've become less comfortable with, but we could call it the current variant of global capitalism, if we want to call it that, in the digital age. That's the times that we live in, if you like. And of course, many of you, or all of you, will be familiar with this list of characteristics. This is what's happened over the last 40 years, more or less, in economies around the world. And of course, at the very bottom I have as a phenomenon, it's variegated, meaning that we can't talk about neoliberalism the same way in China as we would in the United States, for example. But we can see these different aspects of neoliberalism taking place in societies around the world. Also is the resilience of neoliberalism. Through the crisis of 2007, 2008, neoliberalism survived, reinventing itself, mutating, if you like. And so this is the world that we live in, it seems like. And of course, neoliberalism is political economy, which ends up impacting on our day-to-day lives and, in fact, who we are. And some of my publications, I've talked about the neoliberal citizen, right, which is maybe something I can come back to in a moment. Now, when we look at higher education in neoliberal times, there have been quite a few publications over the last 15 to 20 years basically decrying or lamenting the direction that universities are taking around the world. Particularly those of us who work in the humanities and social sciences, we look with great alarm at how departments are being closed. There seem to be fewer and fewer students, and areas such as history, for example, looks like it could disappear, which I think would be a real shame. The book on the right you see there, The Toxic University, was published, in fact, 10 years ago, but I think the title kind of sums it up, The Toxic University. Now, in the neoliberal university, and this is taken from Smith, 2017, we have these different characteristics. We have a kind of marketization of education going on, bifurcated workforce where some people move, sorry about that, where some people move into teaching and other people do research. That leads to a great deal of specialization. There's all these characteristics around what I mentioned, kind of neoliberal citizenship, being an individual competition. There's also interesting work on the superstar academics, which is related to the notion of the attention economy. There's managerialism, audit culture, metrification, the H-index, all of this sort of thing, and the humanities in question. And this whole thing about pursuing the global university, which is really fundamental to the whole notion of internationalization. So I represent the way things have gone by having this picture of Karl Marx, poring over documents, reading in the British Library, maybe in 1860. This was academic. This is what academics did. We read and sort of thinking and this sort of thing, to the kind of go-getter you see on the right, which we're expected to do, the new prototype, if you like, in academia. Now, worldwide, this has become a kind of dominant policy discourse. It's presented as ideologically neutral. There's a lot of work in neoliberalism in general talking about, TINA, there is no alternative. And very often we're presented with various phenomena around us that are historically situated as if they were the only way, the natural way of life. And so very much the internationalization is taken for granted. Universities must be international. The goals are interesting to look at. This is a selection, but I think these are key goals that we often see when people talk about internationalization. And if you read through these, you'll notice, quite a few things. But one thing you'll notice is the way that the goals are much more instrumental, even economic in nature, and less about what we might understand in a more perhaps innocent way as education or learning, right? It's about situating the university in such a way that it can compete. There's even the generation of income here. In some parts of the world, it's quite important. In the United Kingdom, for example, overseas students pay 3 or 4 times more in tuition fees than home students, right? In any case, we have this, these are kind of the general goals that are set. And one thing that happens in internationalization, and here we get to the point of English, is that Englishization is sort of inserted into this. Now, Englishization has been going on for some time. There's always going to be a political economy behind Englishization, if we go back 50, 60 years ago. And in neoliberal times, we can see this much more clearly, I think, in what happens with internationalization. So this idea that in a wide range of activities in higher education are taking place in English. So not just instruction, but administration. And of course, when academics go to conferences, the understanding is that they will speak in English at international conferences and publications as well. And we see the dying of publications in local languages, some of which are quite big languages. And this is an ongoing matter, if you like. I'm a ICREA professor, which is like Iker Basque, And what I find interesting is from the beginning, they do most things in English, like a lot of correspondence. Probably at least half of the ICREA professors are at a minimal Spanish speakers, and many of them are Catalan speakers as well, and yet the communication tends to be in English. Although I've had conversations with people at ICREA in Catalan, I might see them a second time and they're just speaking to me in English, right? So again, this is part of the kind of, it's an imposition of English in a way, but it seems to be part of the whole package. You know, ICREA must take place in English because it's an international program. Okay, now Englishization, one aspect of it is English medium instruction, and of course you can find all kinds of definitions like these for what English medium instruction is. But again, content is taught through English in a context where English is not the normal language of use or the official language. Now, in doing research on this notion of internationalization, Englishization, and English medium instruction, or EMI, I came across an interesting publication. I've actually translated this from Spanish into English. And this was a critique of the internationalization strategy of the Spanish Ministry of Education and Sport. If you look at the list here, this is similar to what we looked at before. Internationalization is about all of these things according to the ministry. And I find brain circulation quite interesting as a translation. But in any case, we have this notion that, again, internationalization is happening, it's going to happen. And it's interesting to see people like Bathu Martinez and company in 2016 launching a kind of critique of this. And one of the things they say is the implementation of these measures has brought to light the great differences and lack of coordination that exist in general terms among different Spanish universities. And I think this would apply to universities in many parts of the world. So there's this kind of, embrace that we have to be international, right? I'll show you a quote later from a person who was an English medium instruction coordinator at the University of Lleida, and he says as much. Basically, if you're a university today, you must be international. And of course, that means doing things in English. Now, consider this, though. Internationalization at home, because if we look at English medium instruction, there are different contexts for it. But internationalization at home would be when we have English medium instruction very much in a context where English is not normally used. And I put here a typical scenario possibly. You have 20 students. I've seen this actually, that's why I put it here. But you have 20 students, all of them are home, and all of them are, I say putative, but basically Catalan-Spanish bilinguals, right? There's one lecturer from home, Catalan-Spanish bilingual, and teaching and assessment materials are all in English. I put a question mark. Some of them might not be. And language used during the sessions is always English, although there's a question mark there. We'll come to that in a moment. And this all leads to a kind of a risk of pantomime, because I always think if an anthropologist from another planet came down and went to this classroom, he'd say, hold on a second. Okay, all of these people speak Catalan and Spanish, but they're doing the class in English. What's the point? Yeah. So, well, the point is, as part of the internationalization and everything else, we have to do things in English. But it does, I think, I'm saying this rather glibly, but I think there is an issue here. And this scenario, I think, happens quite a bit. There is the idea that there's one student, one Erasmus student from the Netherlands, for example, which was mentioned earlier, then that tips the balance, right? And maybe that's what's happened today with me speaking in English. There's an idea that if you start having people who don't speak a local language, then English is the lingua franca, and that takes over. But like I said, I've seen classes where the entire class are all local students, and so none of them are actually in need of having a lingua franca. Now, there's the other issue, and this was one that we were particularly interested in the project that I worked on, which is what happens when there are breakdowns in communication around the English language, right, in an ME classroom. And we were quite interested in seeing whether the instructors, basically what we did was we interviewed STEM lecturers. These were people all working in areas of STEM, particularly engineering and in agronomy. And we interviewed them, and then we proceeded to observe them teaching and also interview them further about their teaching, right? This is kind of the general plan. And we had like 6 case studies that we went into a great deal of detail with. And one thing we were interested in is this idea, do they ever act as English teachers? Do they ever sort of like pause in delivering content in English to actually focusing on the English language in any way? And I have here the case of Jaime, which is a pseudonym, which I'll be looking at. Now, what constitutes a focus on language? Well, in our mind, we were thinking of traditional competences, you know, grammar, morphology, syntax, pronunciation, lexis, and stretching that to discourse and genre, some notion of text structure and appropriacy. But there's also questions of multimodality. This is something I've become quite interested in over the last couple of decades, is how, you know, it's very difficult to think about only the linguistic when we look at communication. We have to look at physical stance, gaze, hand gestures, facial expressions, hairstyle, dress, any kind of ornamentation, such as piercings or whatever. All of this communicates, right? It's part of the sort of general package we have that we present to other people. And then at the bottom here, I have this idea of issues around presenting, because what we noticed was there was all of these lectures would have oral presentations. They had their students presenting something. So usually in groups of 2 or 3, they would present at the end of the last couple of days of the course. They would present on some topic, 5 to 10 minutes. And this seemed to be kind of, everybody did this, right? And so I think the whole issue of presenting comes into it as an important part of kind of it mixes with the language issues, if you like. Now, Jaime, when he was asked about this, the quotes I'll give you today will be in Spanish and Catalan, and I'll give you an English translation on the right. I'll just read the English translation. But, you know, he says, I don't really have the training to be able to correct or to know when it's may or should or ought to. I think that's your job. And he was referring to us who were doing the interview. I mean, people who really have a superior linguistic knowledge. And then he talks about these 4 months, even if it's very applied way, flooded with English terms, not with grammar. And Jaime had this theory that he did a lot of work on lexical items. He was teaching a course on pig farming, and I learned far more about pig farming than I never imagined I would learn, observing his classes. And so he had a lot of vocabulary around, you know, the structures where the pigs were housed, or any number of other names for pigs and all these different things. So he taught this as items of vocabulary, not English language teaching. What's interesting is how he used translation. And I'll come to some examples in a moment, but with vocabulary on one occasion, he just went through, bam, bam. I'll say, here's the word he functioned more in Spanish than Catalan. So he'd say the word in Spanish, then English, Spanish, English. And so basically he was using translation as a teaching strategy, which is part of language teaching, yet he didn't recognize it as such. You know, he just sort of said, well, I'm doing this in English, and, you know, that's the way it is. This is him in action. This is a transcription of part of one of his classes. And you can see this is primarily in English, which it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be English medium instruction. But you'll notice how he uses strategically translation here. So it's not just a list. Here he's integrating it. So you have the manure pit, las fosas de purín, you know, and then he comes back to that, las fosas, vale, and he goes through like that, right? Now, in this class, there were 2 students from South Korea who tended to sit in the back. So I don't know exactly what they made of this when he would use these translations. But anyway. Now, another thing, well, what I mentioned earlier were the oral presentations. And to evaluate these presentations, we found that these lectures used rubrics that looked something like this, right? They all had different ones. And again, this was also quite interesting. They all did this individually, and they constructed their rubrics, evaluation rubrics, based on downloading something online, changing it, whatever, sometimes translating. This was originally in Spanish, and it's been translated into English. And what's interesting is, if you look at the categories, it doesn't even line up that from 9 to 6 to 4, in some cases, he's not even talking about the same thing exactly. So, for example, at the very bottom, which I marked in red, which I think are the ones where he focuses more on language, even though he said that he didn't focus on language, you have maintains eye contact, adequate body language, that's one thing. And then in the second column, not very, very tone, little eye contact. So the eye contact's there, but now he's talking about tone. And then he moves on to put monotonous at the bottom end. So the terminology starts shifting across the categories. So when he talked about this, you know, we would push him, in fact, to think, well, you are doing English language teaching to an extent. And so we would get into exchanges like this one. And this was based on the rubric. A colleague of mine and I were asking him, you know, to explain to us what these different categories meant. And there's this thing about speed, which you could see in the previous slide. And so in the middle part, he says, what's the relationship with fluency? And then he said speed, and then it's not just talking fast. He said, no, it's included in fluency. I mean, here, this would, and then he recognizes this would be the most linguistic section, the only linguistic section. Speak clearly. So then he kind of goes back, but he would often go back and forth. You know, I don't do language teaching, but then he would end up revealing that he did at some level. What's interesting to look at also is the feedback he gave to students. So the students would do their presentations. They would be video recorded. And he had this rubric I mentioned earlier, although I think he would probably fill it in later and put together the evaluation when he could view the video. But on the spot, he also gave feedback. And these are three examples, which I find kind of interesting. One of them, the person he asked very well, and he talks to this group of students who have just presented. Group one, what would you like to ask them? And so there's a student who asks the question, where is the farm situated? And he corrects this by saying located. And then another student said located, it's a rule. So the answer is incorporated by student two as located. I don't know, for me in English, situated is fine. But he has kind of made a sort of hyper-correction here. The second one is kind of interesting because one of the students put Q&A at the end, question and answer, and he asked, what is this? And so the student explained it, and then he laughs when he hears that. And then the final one is one of the old typical ones in English, 14 or 40, right? They're kind of talking about this. So again, he inevitably gets into English language teaching, I would say. That's just a small example, but across the 6 lectures that we were in contact with, in general, there was a denial of this. You know, that I don't do English language teaching. It's not what I do. We couldn't work out whether that was a kind of an attitude of that it was beneath them to do that, dressed up as I'm not qualified to do it. Right? So it's kind of interesting kind of tension in that regard. Okay, now there is an English-only policy that kind of comes with English medium instruction. And we saw previously with Jaime that he would use translation quite extensively. This is another example where we see Elisabeth, who's teaching, and I think what we see here is language switches into Catalan, which have to do with affect and also with content. So at the beginning, she's trying to get the students to respond. They've been working on drawings. It was like a cooling system, and so they're meant to be talking about it. And then she's kind of asking, you know, where would we, you know, find, what was the question, in fact? I can't remember anyway. In the generator, in the evaporator, in the condenser. So somebody answer this question, please. And she says, hello, and if I want to cool down a fluid, where am I going to do this? That's the question. And finally, one of the students answers. And then she switches to Catalan, gracias, Sara. And then she goes in to this whole thing about how she's getting depressed. And she mentions, you know, Barcelona beat Real Madrid in basketball, and goes into that, and then switches, as she comments on a student's work, she goes back into, she says here, good, in English, but then she goes back into Catalan, and she starts explaining content, right? So she would use English very, you know, in general, but she would use Catalan strategically. She would make comments about her own life or something, you know, something more affective in nature. And she would also, there was one section where she gave this very long explanation in English, again, this was an engineering class, right? So quite technical in English. And then she proceeded to deliver it again in Catalan, to be sure. And of course, that raises the issue, what's the point? You know, if the students all understand Catalan, why not just do it in Catalan, right? Now, one thing that I was interested in at the beginning, and this is before I even did this study, when I first started hearing about English medium instruction, I thought about, it's not so easy. If you've been lecturing for 20 years in Catalan or in Spanish or both, suddenly you lecture in English. You might speak English because you go to conferences and deliver papers in English, but you know, to do the whole thing, organizing the course and every day, everything in English, that's quite a task to take on. And I came across some theories of something called, what we might call role diminishment, and also what we might call disrupted professional identity, and I'll explain that. Now, the case study here, this is actually the subject of a recent paper, which is called The Dark Side of Emmy, and it talks about one of the informants named Begoña, who was particularly kind of always on edge about her own teaching, about her English, and everything having to do with the whole enterprise of teaching her classes. She was also in engineering, teaching engineering classes in English. So I'm just going to go through some of her material. How much time have I got?
20.
Oh, good, okay. So this is where she's talking about how she got into how she actually got into English medium instruction. I will say the instructors we dealt with, none of them felt coerced into doing this. She was offered an incentive, as she explains here, that she would be fast-tracked to a promotion, but the other ones, they were in it because they were interested, and you know, they thought it was a good idea, and they agreed with the general policy of internationalization. They also were all early career academics, which is kind of interesting. So the older academics in the departments were not doing English medium instruction in general. So she talks here about, they told her she would get a promotion, and then once she actually started teaching, she realized 1 year went by, another year, a third year, and no promotion. So anyway, and she called it a mentira cochina, which is kind of interesting. So it's a filthy lie. Okay. Now, she also, again, this next quote goes to the whole heart of how she felt, as I said, on edge. You know, she never seemed completely comfortable teaching her courses in English. So again, she did it for a more instrumental reason, to get a promotion, but then she found herself doing it. So, you know. So anyway, she talks about doing a course which is on pedagogy and, you know, learning about how to prepare her class. And as she goes in, she goes off to teach, and everything's super organized. And she says to herself, yes, I'm going to make everything super interactive. And then she says, my English level is crap. And she talks about her cortisol level going up. And again, she goes through and ends up, she kind of explains the situation. She's stuttering, and she feels like, you know, she just, you know, she can't really do the job. And she says, of course, you can know a class in English, meaning she knows the content in English. And yes, you can regurgitate the content, reading the PowerPoint, but that's not what it's about. So she's very conscious that teaching involves interaction and more than just sort of regurgitating the content. But that would be a strategy, perhaps, that would be safer for her to sort of control the discourse in English. In the next quote, she talks about, again, being stressed out, but also mentions something that I think goes to the heart of Emmy, at least this criticism of why are we doing this. And she talks about she's just come from teaching a good class in Spanish, and she had the experience of teaching the exact same class or course in Spanish, and she was primarily a Spanish speaker, by the way. So she would teach in Spanish and in English. And so she could compare her performance. And so, again, a lot of her unease coming through when she spoke to us was about this, knowing that in English she wasn't able to deliver the content the way that she would like to. And it's here she talks about stuttering, and she gets stuck, and that sort of thing. So again, there's kind of a torture going on here, if you like. This is her teaching in action. This is taken from one of her classes. So to get an idea of, you know, was it really that bad? If you look at this, it's fairly compact. I suppose if we wanted to be an English corrector, we could go through and find things that are somewhat anomalous, but the communication is there. And so this is the kind of teaching she was doing very often she was having. And she, again, you know, having done this for 3 or 4 years, she was experienced enough to have kind of like, you know, little kind of packets of discourse prepared that she could deliver in English. So again, you know, for me, not the most interesting topic. It's not something I know that much about. But again, she's going, you know, going through it in English, like not switching into Spanish, for example. Now, what I see going on here is, on the one hand, has to do with disciplines, academic disciplines, and how we develop a kind of a disciplinary identity as academics. And Ken Hyland has a very interesting book in 2012 on this topic. He talks about disciplines as having a real existence. The discipline has to do with all of these activities you see listed here, things that we do as part of our academic life. As I said earlier, these are activities we could have been doing in any number of languages, but not English. And then once we move to English medium instruction, suddenly all of this is done in English. And of course, this becomes part of who we are. But again, there could be a little bit of tension here as we move linguistically across different languages, if you like. She talks about, you know, members having a sense of being or part of a, it's sort of about sense of belonging, you know, as an academic. And this becomes part of who you are, how you see yourself. And so like I said, what I was interested in really was people who had come from maybe a beginnings of a career where everything was not done in English to moving into a world where everything is done in English. And what would be the impact on that sense of self as having a disciplinary identity. And I think what Begonia was talking about when she talks about, I can do this class in Spanish and it works much better. If I do it in English, obviously, there are a few problems. There's also related to, I mentioned this earlier, this idea of role identity, and I found an interesting definition of role identity, like a social position a person holds in a larger societal structure. And again, this could be related to disciplinary identity, if you like. But there's a sense of, we have this sense of who we are and our role in society. And so diminishment comes in, how an individual could be made to feel less important, and sort of the kind of a status reduction and a redefinition. So you start feeling like you're being reduced by the very practice of teaching through English. I'll have to rush through a few of these things, but again, she talks about student evaluations, and she talks about how some of the students were making comments about her English. And there also was kind of a tension around students who were Erasmus from countries of Northern Europe in particular, and students who were local. And she seemed to think the students who were Erasmus were the ones who were less happy with her English. This is anecdotally, I've heard this kind of comment in other contexts. Then she talks about, you know, being under a lot of pressure, and she felt pressure from the system. As I said, she voluntarily went into ME, but on the condition she would get a promotion, and then she found that it was eating up all of her time. Okay? Now, one of the things going on is this is kind of dressing this up in a little bit of theory, but Foucault's notion of the gaze, kind of institutional gaze. And so these these lectures are being, there's a kind of an English medium instruction, Englishization gaze cast upon them, in which they're expected to engage in activities in English. They're expected to be a particular type of academic, and there's a new kind of normativity around this, the new age academic doing things in English. This is the quote I mentioned earlier from one of the coordinators, and he talks about, for the future, we need to be international, and everything is in English. If you want to sell products around the world, you have to do everything in English. So again, one thing is look at disciplinary identity, look at this idea of, you know, your role and role diminishment, and then this notion that there's a gaze, an English medium instruction gaze being cast on people. But in the end, she talked about she did things for recognition, which I thought was kind of interesting. And if you look at the end of this quote, at the end, she says, in the end, I've learned to do it. I'm happy, I'm satisfied. This came as quite a surprise. This was after we'd observed her teaching, after we'd spoken to her on several occasions. It's kind of the final interview. And we were quite surprised by this, but then it also was revealed to us that she got her promotion. And so it seems that once she got her promotion, she started seeing this in a slightly different way, which is kind of interesting or understandable, maybe. Okay? But whatever the case, Begonia is a particularly, I think, poignant case of the kind of tension that somebody can feel being in this situation. The final issue is very quick, domain loss. And I know people, a couple of people from Denmark who tell me that domain loss, they don't really think there's much there, that it's not really an issue. I have a more common sense approach to domain loss. By the way, domain loss is when more and more activities are done in English and not local language, and of course this has an effect on how the local languages are seen. For example, I was talking to Sergio about this, but I haven't got very, very recent statistics, but if you look at the whole normalization of Catalan going back 4 or 5 decades, the whole plan from the late 70s, in fact, but certainly implemented in the early 1980s, and then moving forward through all kinds of permutations, the idea is that more and more things happen in Catalan. And of course, in academia, the idea, for example, looking at PhD theses written in Catalan. I think Adolfo Suarez said at one point in 1978 or something, how are you going to write a thesis in Basque or Catalan, this kind of thing. So again, obviously, he was wrong. But this is, this idea that you could sort of look at what people are doing. And of course, one statistic I saw about 10 years ago, this varies by university, but you had something like 40% in Catalan, 40% in Castellano, Spanish, and 20% almost all in English, although there could be other languages. But you'd have to look at the different disciplines as well, because notoriously with these types of comparisons we see in the social sciences and humanities, there tends to be more use of local languages, not English, and in the sciences, like STEM disciplines, we're seeing in countries like Sweden, 98, 99% of the theses being written in English. And of course, this moves from the PhD level down through the system. So what happens to a language? I remember also I was still in London, so let's say 2010, there was a student, one of my students, in fact, from China, a PhD student, and she did her PhD about English in China. And she was talking about the introduction, Englishization of different domains of activity in China in what seemed to be a very positive way. And I remember the late Günter Kress, who was there. Günter Kress is a very interesting, do you know Günter Kress, anyone? So if you think about multimodality studies, he is sort of one of the pioneering scholars in that field. But Günter Kress is very interesting because he was born in Germany and spent the first 16 years of his life in Germany and then moved to Australia, and at the age of 16 and didn't know any English. And apparently he was a good student, and he ended up going to university and became a world-renowned scholar. But he mentioned to this student of mine, he said, so this is all fine, but are we going to have a situation where in the future, and he talked about Germany, using English medium instruction. He said, well, we have a situation in a couple of generations where students are reading Goethe in English, right? And so, again, this is very anecdotal, if you like, but these are real issues. And like I said here, the common sense argument that if you're not using a language for particular activities, how on earth is it associated with those activities, and how does it become sort of a fully functioning language, right? And I think this kind of pitch, that we've had towards EMI is being done in a fairly haphazard way, not so much based on research, but on notions of we must internationalize. And of course, what could be lost? And I'm sure that there's a great deal of sensitivity about that here. There certainly is in Catalonia and of course around the world, the Netherlands, for example. But again, how complete will domain loss be? Will it ever be the case? It is the case if you work, my understanding, if you work in a department in a university in the Netherlands or in Sweden, for example, you can do most of the stuff you do in English, but you do get left out of things, right? And the other side of that, I notice when I go to international conferences and I can run into people who maybe speak Catalan or speak Spanish, and I can sort of get off into groups away from this dominance of English. It's kind of interesting because the monolingual English speakers are the ones who are left out in that regard, for once, if you like. So again, there's kind of, there are little areas where languages are not going to disappear, if you like. But certainly this basic notion that if we're not using Euskera or Catalan or whatever for various academic activities, where are we going with this, right? A bit rich for me to say that because like I said, I end up giving a lot of talks in English, but I'm kind of I'm not saying against this, but I'm very sort of skeptical about the way that Emmy is being rushed in, and people are rushing into it, if you like. So I'll end on that point. I've had to rush through quite a few things, and there's quite a bit I haven't said here. I do have a fair number of publications that came out of the study I mentioned. I've kind of retired from this now. I kind of exhausted everything I have to say about English medium instruction in general. But these are this is a list of publications, and if you are interested, if you go to my Academia Edu page, not to ResearchGate, but Academia Edu, I think they're all there in some form or another, like a manuscript version, not so much I have to be careful of copyright issues, but there will be a version of all of these that's available if you're interested. And if you look at, I've covered a range of topics, but basically the kind of critiques that I've been talking about today. So on that note, I'm finished. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's time for questions, comments. Yep.
Yeah, thanks. So I was wondering about this part. I'm not an English teacher, actually. Because as I see it, I am providing tools to my students. One of which is, so English is actually the tool that we use in science, that end of story. But I'm not teaching them English. I'm teaching them, if you will, world English, which is a very different thing from any native English variety. So this thing about what you called multimodality, or the emotional content, or even cultural resonances, are actually to be taken off when I'm teaching in English here. Or is that not the case? Or how does this play? Yeah. Because I'm not teaching, so it's this thing, I really don't want to teach English, actually. So.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. I think the whole issue about the sort of affective side or some sort of personal investment in the language beyond simply delivering content, as we're talking about today. Of course, there's a lot of work on English as a lingua franca and the argument that there is an evolution there going on that could be separated from nativized forms of English. I'm kind of critical of the whole ELF thing because I think it's kind of slides around I haven't read much about it in the last 2 or 3 years, but I think it slides around quite a few issues. But one of the, there's a thing about who owns English, and I would argue that, you could argue that languages are owned, maybe that's not the right word, but there are native speakers of languages, or whatever we want to call them. We don't like native speakers, what are they? But people who've kind of come up through languages around the world, and English just happens to be at the same time an international language. So when English is in nativized environments, those people do have kind of an ownership of that English. On the other hand, the international English that's being spoken at conferences or maybe today, you know, in any number of contexts, is still based on native speaker models. But the thing about the investment thing, you know, what you're talking about, can we do that? When we're using a language of any kind at some level, you know, I've written a lot about identity and how we engage in acts of identity continuously. What I'm doing now, I'm engaging in acts of identity. I could be reproducing myself as I've done on other occasions, or I could move into new terrain by using new language or new gestures or whatever. But so from that point of view, if there is an identity issue, even if we do see English as just simply a tool, right, to get by. Because the more, if we start using it a lot, it starts taking over that domain, going back to the idea of domain of activity. So our academic self, if most of it is done in English, then English is an identity-making language for us, and therefore does have an affective weight or something more than just a tool. I don't know if you can treat a language as just a tool. But I do take your point. There are occasions where it would seem that way, that you know, that yes, yeah, you're equipping somebody, you should know this, or you should be able to read. For example, you could teach reading in English, but not speaking, you know, that sort of thing. But even so, even reading, only reading in English, there would be some element. Because if we're spending time doing something, then we're spending time identity making. That's my view. So there is a part of us that takes that on. We can see this in digitized, the part of our world that's digitized. We can't remove, it's a different issue maybe, but we can't remove the digital part of it. We are making ourselves online, and for younger people, they're making themselves online through digitalization, if you like, much more than they're doing it face-to-face, right? So this is important. It's not that that's a separate identity, or not identity, and identity is only what happens face-to-face. So again, by expanding this kind of notion of identity, I find it difficult to accept or to understand how using a language, particularly if it's done continually, doesn't have at least it's partially part of who we are. And therefore, there's going to be some affective load, something beyond just using a tool, if you like. And this is especially the case when an academic is using English a lot. They're going to a lot of conferences and speaking in English all the time, or maybe they go away for 2 years somewhere and everything is done in the department in English. English is a part of who they are. That would be my point.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments?
Sorry?
I have quite a quick question. We saw the opinions of teachers and professors, right? But do the students, did you interview also the students, or do you know what the students think about learning everything in English? Yeah.
We tried to, the study I mentioned, we tried to incorporate the students. We tried to get them to keep logs, to actually every day they had a class to provide a kind of an account of the class using their telephones and then send it to us. That failed miserably. I mean, you might have 20 students and 2 of them would do it for 2 weeks, and so we kind of forgot about that. But we did have, sometimes when we observed classes, we might talk to the students. But we didn't do much in that regard. But we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. A lot of things we observed or we heard said by students, but not so much documented, if you like, as sort of formally part of the database. But one thing I will say is that I found interesting is we could talk about the English of the students. What we did observe was the students didn't speak to each other in English. So, and there's that old thing, if you imagine you're studying a language, whatever language, and the teacher, part of the teacher's job is to circulate and say, speak English, right? Constantly telling the students to speak in English, or speak in French, or speak in Skate, or whatever. Of course, these STEM lectures didn't do that because they didn't see their role as English teachers. But the students, were left. So you have the teacher setting up an activity, PowerPoint in English, written materials in English, and the students are doing the task, and they're speaking in Catalan or speaking in Castellano, right? So, and that was a constant. Only when there was a student who was from outside, if you like, so a student who was Erasmus, would you see the student speaking in English. And of course, what was happening was a kind of, you know, and Jaime actually talked about this. They're exposed to English. That's the important thing. They're hearing English. Whatever English, it doesn't matter. They're just hearing English a lot. And so there's some sort of notion that they will take something in, you know, that they'll learn something. But as far as, you know, pushing them to speak English, it was only the oral presentations where that was the only activity they did. And that was 10 minutes or something at the end of the course where they would have to speak in English. And so the general level, also the level, a lot of the students, we did actually check on the students and the lecturers who were participating about their level, you know, B1, B2, whatever it was. And a lot of the students tended to be around B1 in this kind of classification system for whatever that's worth. And B2 is seen as an exit level for university students in Catalonia. I don't know about here. But I don't know if I understand a B2 level to be kind of an intermediate level. I'm not sure that's really enough to fully function academically in a language. So again, that's another kind of problem, I think, with the whole thing, the whole operation, is whether students are just being bombarded in English, but they're not really this idea, because this is complicated, thinking through a language about complex issues, right? And there just hasn't been enough, I think. Obviously, in some contexts, there's a great deal more research, maybe, and people looking at, you know, learning psychology and a number of things. But in a lot of places around the world, you find it's kind of, well, internationalization, yeah, okay, you can teach in English, okay, well, okay, you teach in English. Students, oh, well, they'll learn, if you like. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the teachers did not really play the role of language teachers, and they would leave the students use their L1s.
Yeah.
Did you check the learning goals and objectives for the course in the curriculum? Was language or English part of the learning goals?
Oh, that's a good question. I was kind of surprised that there were cases where when they came down to an exam, and in one case I think there was a final project, they didn't have to do it in English. Right? So that was kind of interesting after all the input had been in English. But yeah, I mean, as far as the only check, if you like, on, you know, the content delivered, you know, was it learned, if you like, was through examinations and everything else. But like I said, there was one case in particular, I think even the examinations, I don't know if it's multiple choice or something, they might have had an option of not doing it in English or something like that. So you could see here that the instructors themselves were a bit concerned about this, whether they'd gone through this whole exercise of teaching it in English, but their real concern in the end is, can they take this forward into another? You know, let's say they're doing part 1 of a content area, are they going to be able to go into part 2, having done it in English? Can they carry, you know, go on forward, saying, I understand all of the issues here, right? So, yeah.
So in that case, English is kind of a tool because they're using it to teach content. They're not focusing on teaching language per se.
Well, yes, but my point about that was it depends on, I think if it's still part of their lives. They're still hearing English. It's just, yes, okay, it's limited or whatever, but my whole point about the relationship between language and identity would be that there's something going on if you're exposed to a lot of English. Obviously, if it's just 1 or 2 times in your life you hear English, no, right? But the more you're immersed in a language, it becomes, you start, it's part of who you are. That part could be very small, I think. That's what I would say, but yeah. By the way, the tool metaphor is very much, I think, the way it's sold, you know, as far as you have to learn English, this whole mantra, everybody has to learn English, it's very much sold as a tool.
Yeah, but at the same time, if it's not officially put in the curriculum as part of the learning goals, then it's not on the teacher's minds as much.
Well, actually, it is part of the goals. This is the whole thing, whether we slide from more like clear, you know, what are we actually doing here by definition? Theoretically, you're just teaching the content in English, right? But there is a notion that the students, by the time they finish their academic program, that their English level will have improved. So there's kind of a double discourse going on there.
But not part of the concrete courses.
Yeah, no, they're not given they're not given an exam. Yes, they could be asked to do an exam at the end. This was floated in Catalonia and then pulled back, but they were going to actually examine all students before they could get a BA or a BSc degree. They would be given an exam, but the level was like B2 or something like that. And that was brought in and then rescinded immediately, and I'm not sure what the situation is right now. But yeah, so it's mixed.
Le voy a hacer la pregunta en español. Creo que he entendido bien, pero prefiero hacerlo así. Usted ha presentado muchos ejemplos de personas que están trabajando en el inglés como lengua de instrucción. Y en general esos ejemplos muestran dificultades, problemas. No sé si entiendo que esa es la situación general o esos ejemplos responden, pues eso, son ejemplos, ¿no? ¿Hasta qué punto eso es significativo de la situación general, ¿no? Eso por un lado, porque claro, eso me lleva a reflexionar a lo que nosotros con el euskera estamos haciendo y que eso es una cosa que también se suele hacer. Hay muchos profesores que enseñan en euskera cuando el euskera es su segunda lengua y a veces pues la utilizan con dificultad. Y por lo tanto pues se tiende a considerar que eso es una enseñanza no demasiado, no demasiado efectiva, válida, etc. Y claro, eso para la situación del euskera es muy peyorativo. Al inglés no le pasa nada, porque por unos cuantos profesores que enseñen más o menos bien o mal, el inglés tiene todos los recursos del mundo para que siga siendo la lengua franca mundial y todo lo que se quiera, ¿no? Pero quiero decir, ¿hasta qué punto me parece interesante lo que hace usted, de destacar esos problemas, pero no veo cuál es la solución, qué manera de... He visto en su biografía que dice mayor rigor, mayor control, etcétera, ¿no? Pero claro, quiero decir que ¿hasta qué punto es una situación general o es una situación, pues sí, que se da, pero que a pesar de todo, y también ha aparecido hay algunos ejemplos en los que aún sufriendo al final había gente que decía estoy satisfecha, creo que había alguna citación de ese tipo. Entonces, me genera una cierta inquietud esa manera de presentar los temas, porque claro, si hacemos el reflejo a nuestra situación, pues es muy peligroso, porque aquí rápidamente podemos llegar a la conclusión, enseñar en euskera, inmersión, eso pues no genera una enseñanza suficientemente eficaz, etc. Es una reflexión. Ya sé que la respuesta es muy complicada, pero no sé si responde o no a lo que usted ha querido decir. Estoy haciendo una lectura.
O sea, la pregunta sería si yo creo que eso es... Bueno,
¿Eso es lo general? ¿Eso representa lo que pasa en general o son casos que usted ha seleccionado, no sé, con qué grado de significación?
Son casos relevantes, o sea, son casos que resuenan con otros contextos. Yo no puedo generalizar y además la cuestión de que si puede variar de un país a otro, ¿no? O un contexto a otro, ¿no? Pero creo que en general no es atípico lo que he presentado, no es atípico. En cuanto a la solución, que yo creo que has preguntado, si propongo alguna solución a esto, no lo sé, no lo veo, porque creo que estamos en esta tendencia o una especie de inercia hacia, o sea, en inglés, o sea, todo se tiene que hacer en inglés. Y deshacer esto o pararlo o introducir otros idiomas sería muy difícil. Yo siempre me pregunto una cosa, la China, que yo creo que ya debe ser la primera economía mundial, aunque pueden decir que no todavía, pero si no lo es ahora, lo será. Si ellos, los chinos podían decir un día, hemos funcionado en inglés hasta este momento, hemos aceptado esta cuestión todo en inglés y no sé qué. Ahora somos nosotros los más poderosos, entonces, ¿qué han hecho los países poderosos en el pasado? Han impuesto una serie de cosas, pero entre otras cosas el idioma, el inglés, y el inglés es el idioma internacional. Mira los Estados Unidos, ¿no? O sea, hay cuestiones de imperios y estas cosas, ¿no? Entonces, la cuestión de la China es que ¿qué pasa si la China cambia de opinión? Y dice mandarín, o putonghua, la variante así oficial, estaría operando como han hecho los imperios en el pasado. Entonces, ¿por qué no? Hace poco estuve en Macao, y había mucha gente, muy interesante, ¿no? Macao, la dinámica lingüística del cantonés y estas cosas. Mucha gente del norte que habían bajado, los chinos, los que hablaban mandarín, y se palpaba una cosa, ¿no? Un poco como si fuera Madrid aquí o a Cataluña, en algún caso, ¿no? Respecto a cómo veían el cantonés, por ejemplo, los que hablaban mandarín que venían de otra parte de la China. Entonces, yo cuando hablaba de esto, así, no tan directamente, pero decía, bueno, el mandarín podía ser idioma internacional, no me decían nada, ¿no? O sea, no iban a, sí, es lo que estamos en ello, ¿no? O sea, no, tampoco. Pero yo creo que es una pregunta a plantear, o sea, que a plantearse, porque ¿qué pasa si hacen esto? Entonces, de momento creo que sí, que todo el mundo dice, bueno, todo en inglés y seguimos. Y va más esta cuestión. Pero no sé si va a ser así. Yo no lo puedo parar yo, no lo puede parar una persona y ni siquiera una comunidad, pero lo veo, no sé, lo veo muy difícil, pero no sé, dentro de esto si tiene que ser así, pues se podría mejorar cómo se hacen las cosas, que un poco con la línea que he adoptado hoy, ¿no? Que es una crítica de cómo se está llevando a cabo, ¿no? El English Medium Instruction.